Height isn't an
Height is a
advantage.
good thing.
Oh,
You're
great
higher.
advantage.
It's so much better than seeing Michelle up on a ladder.
Yeah.
You're trying to do that.
Okay, so can we resume?
Yeah.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, so just briefly, board members, the slide I put out, I realize is a generally worded slide, but just so we get a little bit of direction so that when you ask staff to come back to you with recommended language for a letter to the council, we're talking, focusing on the M2 rezoning,
Including circulation, because they put that in there,
no, and including
gives
circulation.
us a hook on Willow.
Right. But what I think we can translate sort of the direction into what I call planning speak. In other words, there's a structure to the document, where we want it. Seems to me the key one is implementation actions. Because the goals and policies are good to set sort of the table, but the real thing is implementation actions that we get the city to agree to. And I just wanted to say, although I understand I wasn't at the meeting about the May 1st deadline, that I think that an implementation policy that the city agrees to implement a impact fee for fire services on new development, subject to its review and approval. I understand the May 1st thing, but I think they can make commitments and put stuff in their document that we can hold them to that says they will take an adopted fee program approved by your board, and they can't commit to approving something they haven't seen. But if you get my point, I mean the May 1st, and I think Director Bernstein brought this up, I'm really not convinced that they need to see the final document to be able to commit to what we're saying is they're flagging that, yes, they support this, development should pay their cost for services, and they would support a properly prepared and presented impact fee. So I'm just throwing that out as an example.
Tim, I would say those last three bullets
Yeah,
should be part of the communication.
should be.
Should be well.
Part of the
yeah,
communication
yeah.
that goes to the council, the proposal.
Right.
Yeah, we agree with
But
that.
we'll flush them out.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll
Yeah.
flush them out, but
Those principles are the things that we need to nail into concrete. Say, details will follow, folks, but all projects reviewed for fire service impact, all projects may pay cost of services, any special project in the cast must be addressed. And then I would also include things like full participation by the fire department in their planning process at the staff level. And then you can look at the things I put on the table and see which of those are palatable to you.
okay, and that was the point. I appreciate that feedback. It was just to see, and I understand the direction of staff to do our job, but it'd be helpful to get a little color of what the thoughts are, and that's why I wanted to throw out the example on impact fees and on standard of coverage. Similarly, that, the city will use the district's adopted standards of coverage, which means you have to follow through on that. But it's
Right.
their commitment to use it, and I think those types of statements, without saying specifically, and our standards of coverage are types of things that we can bring to you next meeting, because we can't really get all the way down to, response time. Okay, so just, it's more of a conversation, are we on the same page of,
Well, it's to get us
How-
on the same page,
yeah.
to get us on the same page.
Right, but as far as the direction to
Okay.
staff, that kind of level, that kind of specificity, so they commit, okay, that's helpful. Any other comments, of course?
Any other comments before we got to vote on this motion? Okay, all in favor of the motion? Aye. Anyone opposed? So it's unanimously passes. So I just thought would also incorporate item 22, right? Which is, because it's also going to be, we're also including the downtown specific. Right?
Yes.
So that was item 22.
Oh, hey, development.
Yeah.
Now we're in the future.
Okay. So, if we can move on to item 15. Mr. Pryor has been very patient.
Doug has been very patient.
Very patient.
We promised to be number 2 tonight.
You've been very patient.
Thank you so much, Doug, for
So-
being here.
real quick, and Kathy, I know can say something as well, but yeah, thanks to Doug. We've worked with Doug in the past. We've worked with him on this presentation as a staff, a joint effort to kind of pare it down. Some of that was, put as handouts, some will be PowerPoint slides. But I think the overall analysis that he's going to present tonight is very interesting. And hopefully, whether this goes to the Finance Committee or it comes back to staff for additional work to be done, our proposal essentially again, which he has in here, is to address some of the unfunded liability and pay some of that down. That's really where we'd like to go. But again, that's going to have to be direction staff or directed to the Finance Committee. And I think some of the issues that in the past were seen to be much more critical are not as, I thought, not as bad as was presented to me over the last 7 years as a fire chief. So.
Okay, well, so should we just start with Doug's
Yes.
presentation and then, same format, no questions until the end
That
of
would
the
be helpful.
presentation? So that we can kind of get through this. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks. So should we wait now for Director Carpenter?
Well, maybe we should just start. He'll be back soon. We've got a quorum, we should just
It's
start.
up to you, however.
I'm sure he's ready.
He's pretty
If you have
versed in it.
questions or Dean,
Okay.
so, if you don't mind, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is, there's kind of a lot of detail in here, but what we kind of did was we took really the most important information and put it up front. And that's going to be some projections on where the contribution rates are going. And what I'd like to do is kind of go through this, and I think I'll cover a lot. Hopefully a lot of maybe questions you may have as you've gone through this. We'll cover contribution projections, and then also kind of show what will happen if you contribute an additional $12 million to the trust. And also, I'll mention kind of some new developments in terms of options with additional contributions and CalPERS. And finally, there's a slide with some, I don't know if the contribution rates are going to be good news, but I think at the end of it, after the contribution rates, you're going to see some projection on unfunded liability, and I think that's what the chief's mentioned is what is relatively good news. So if we start in, we have first the miscellaneous plan up front, which is a very small portion here, but we've got 2 slides on where those contribution rates are projected to go. There are a number of changes that are built into here. There's detail in the back on it, but let me just kind of run through what's built into these projections. And maybe let me first cover what you're looking at there, which is your contribution rates are two components. You have the normal cost rate, which is the orange line that's projected by years, and then you have the contribution on unfunded liability, which is the red. The green is the total contribution rate. And then what you have on the green is those bars shooting up and down are based on where we think investment performance will be in the future, kind of where your contributions are expected to lie half of the time. So if you look at the far right-hand entry there for 2022-23, half the time your contribution rate would be somewhere between 8.8% of payroll and 20.1% of payroll. Big range, but that's a function of the fact that CalPERS is aggressively invested, and there's going to be large fluctuations in those returns, resulting in large fluctuations in contribution rates. Well, in fact, a little bit what all is built in here. CalPERS has, with the June 30, 13 valuation, which covers that 15-16 first year that these changes that have been implemented will hit is in the 15-16 year. They've changed how the pool, risk pool is allocating costs between the agencies, okay? And this has affected your miscellaneous and safety plans very differently. But what they've done is, in the past, they've allocated the costs between agencies in the pool just on payroll. So if one agency had, say, twice the payroll of another, okay? Essentially, they would get twice the costs. What they've done now, which is really a better method, is they're allocating it on the liability itself, okay? In terms of that unfunded liability contribution rate. And what that's meant is you'll see kind of different results on the miscellaneous versus the safety plan. The miscellaneous, the primary reason, if you look at that red line, the unfunded liability drop, that rate dropping from 6.1, let's see if we can get this pointer working here. But the unfunded liability rate dropping from 6.1% of pay down to 3.8 in 15-16, that's primarily because of that new method, okay? It's got an opposite effect on the safety plan, but for miscellaneous plan, this is good news. Depending on how you look at this, this means, maybe there's argument you've been overpaying in the past, right? Because this is probably a better method, but that's all kind of water under the bridge at this point. It's good news here, your contribution rate expected to drop in 15-16 primarily because of that new method. A couple other changes that are built into these projections are CalPERS is going to change their actual assumptions starting with the June 30, 14 valuation, which will first come into effect in 16-17, okay? And then finally, the other thing that's built in here is as you hire new employees in the future that will come in under the lower benefit formula with PEPRA, that's also built into these projections. So it's pretty much everything we know at this point is sort of built into this as best we can. What you see there on the miscellaneous plan is, look at those thick green line there. Contribution rates are, they come up a little bit. It's not from 14-15, but from 15-16 come up a little bit and level out between 15.7 to 15.9% and on down. Pretty stable. That's kind of where those rates are expected to go. Now, one other change CalPERS has made is that with the change to the risk pools, those two components there, the red line, which is your unfunded liability payment, and the orange, which is the normal cost, are going to be contributed on a very different basis. The normal cost is going to be applied to the payroll. Okay, so if you look at 15-16, that normal cost rate is 11% of payroll. Whatever your payroll is that year, you'll contribute to CalPERS 11% of your miscellaneous payroll. For the unfunded rate, that's not going to be a percent of payroll at all. It's going to be a dollar amount that's set based on the valuation. We've shown this here as a percent of payroll only because we only have kind of one scale. We weren't fancy enough to do two scales in one graph. This shows what overall your contributions are as a percent of payroll, but really for your unfunded rate, go to the next slide here on slide 2. These are in thousands of dollars, so in 15-16, your contribution towards the unfunded will be $70,000, okay? And that amount won't matter how many miscellaneous employees you have, what their payroll is, you pay that $70,000 to CalPERS, plus from the previous side, if we're sticking to 15-16, 11% of payroll for active employees on the normal cost rate, okay? So those are the two on miscellaneous. The rest of this is really on the bigger fish here, which is the CalPERS safety program. And here you see something that's kind of more typical with what's happening with agencies across the state is, you see, if you look at the green line, the total contribution rates are ramping up from 29.6% of payroll in 14-15, peaking out to about a little under 43% of payroll there in 19-20. So that's the kind of some unique things going on with miscellaneous when you saw those flat contribution rates. This is more typical. CalPERS methodology changes, or they have been using this thing called actuarial value of assets. Contributions have not really been sufficient to pay down the unfunded liability. They've gotten rid of that artificial actuarial value of assets, pulled in to really reflect what the market is, what the market value of assets is, and set a target to pay that unfunded liability off. So most agencies are similar to this, a ramp up in your contribution rates over the next 5 or so years, and the escalating contribution rates are going to be probably difficult budget-wise to deal with. The great thing about it is that there is a schedule to pay down the unfunded liability. When we were going around to agencies 2 years ago talking about contribution rates, we used to typically say you ought to think about putting in more than CalPERS is asking, because the schedule is kind of kicking the can down the road. With the new methods here in place, they have a structure to pay the unfunded off. So that's the good news. The bad news is the rates you see there that are expected to peak out at about 43% of pay in 1920. Okay.
What are we currently budgeting? At what percent? We
40
budget more than what is it?
41%.
41%.
31%.
So that's
Okay.
my concern, anyway. I'm not gonna ask questions.
Hold that concern.
Right.
We have solutions.
And so this is, again, similar to the miscellaneous plan. This is on safety. These are contribution rates. The normal cost, which is the orange line, you pay, that's pretty level. That's roughly around 20% of pay for the most part. The reason that's dropping off, that if you notice the miscellaneous plan drops off also, that's because of HEPA people coming in with a lower formula, lower contribution rates, and you have the unfunded liability rate escalating over time. The unfunded liability rate will be paid as a dollar amount, which is shown down here on slide 4, which is for next fiscal year is about $1.7 million, okay, which is fixed amount regardless of what your payroll is. You pay that plus roughly 20% of payroll for the normal costs, okay. So that's all kind of status quo. That's estimate of what we think will happen in the future. The next 2 slides cover what things will look like with an additional $12 million contribution to CalPERS. And we kind of assumed that this would go in for this illustration at June 30th, 2015. The CalPERS has really, at this point, has 2 methods for reflecting. You put additional money in, you would expect to see your contribution rates go down. The question is, how does CalPERS give you a credit for that $12 million, right? And they really have 2 schedules for your plan right now, and we've outlined those on the slides 5 and 6. 5, basically that $12 million is credited back to you over a 30-year period with a ramp up to about 7.1% of payroll over a 5-year period. You then get a credit for 7.1% of payroll for 20 years, and then it ramps back down at the end. And the second method, so there you can see with the 12 million contributions would be 27.2% of payroll next year, and then increased about 36% of payroll there in 1920. Again, those bars going up and down are trying to capture the asset volatility and kind of a range of where half the time the contributions would fall. If you look at this then under their other option here, which is a 22-year amortization credit for that $12 million, okay? This is then, this levels it out a little more. You still get to about a 7.2% of payroll credit in the future, but you don't have, in the previous method under slide 5, there's this ramp up and ramp down, so you kind of have a little more fluctuation. This method would be a little more level.
You mean in the earlier years?
In the
Like
earlier
15,
years,
16, 16, 17, right? Where you're gonna have more fluctuation based on slide
yeah, I
5
think I used the
versus-
word fluctuation. I was thinking more of the middle chart, the middle line there with just the
Oh, like
expected
this.
basis, just that that's a little flatter.
Okay, I got it,
Compare
okay.
it to-
Okay, yeah.
But they're also, they're, and, I'm
like
glad
that.
you brought up the fluctuation. The, CalPERS risk pools had this concept, which was a side fund, which, in the past, the way these side funds were set up in the pool was you were essentially getting charged 7.5% interest on the side fund, right? And it was a very good thing to pay it off because it didn't matter what the returns were on the investments in CalPERS, you always got charged 7.5%. So it was like a credit card debt, right? And there was, if you have money, it made sense to pay it off. With part of the restructuring of how they're looking at the pools, if you put $12 million in, that's not going to be dealt with the same way as a side fund. You're not going to automatically get credited 7.5%. You're going to get credited the actual return essentially on that $12 million. So if CalPERS earns, 17%, you're going to get that return on the money. That's going to be built into your contribution rate in the future. If you get 0%, that's going to be built in, and right. So you have that investment risk on the additional money that goes in, okay? And that, it makes a lot of sense. The way they had that side fund set up before was really an anomaly. It was really a strange thing to do, and it meant that most agencies that could pay it off should have paid it off, and you guys, you did. I can't remember how long ago that was.
12.5, 12.6 million, or 3 at 50.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was about 4 years ago.
yeah.
Okay. And what this last slide that the contribution projections has, these are on percentage of payroll, but this kind of combines with, the previous 3 slides with just where we expect the rates to go. We no longer have the volatility built in here. We don't have the normal cost in UAL. We have really just here, the green and the red lines are the 2 options for paying off the 12 million in terms of how CalPERS reflects them and where the contribution rates go. And where maybe I should have started was the blue line is without an additional contribution where your rates are expected to go. So you can see the savings, what you kind of get out of that $12 million on an expected basis through 22, 23. And there is, in the last few weeks, there's been development there's really another option here. I mean, if you look at this slide, look at the green and the red, right, you might say, well, why is CalPERS only giving us 2 options for how we're crediting the 12 million? Why can't we do it some other way, right? Why can't we go to CalPERS and say, well, maybe we want to, start the credit out so that our contribution rates are higher now, but drop in the future to a lower rate, right? I mean, it's just a matter of how you structure that credit. And CalPERS, it's possible they would be able to do that, but they haven't given any indication that they would at this point. The other option that's recently become available is that PARS and PFM have set up a trust that essentially, I don't know the best way to say this, kind of mirrors the CalPERS trust. So it's a pension trust. Any money going into this PARS or PFM trust can only be used for pensions. Can only be used, I shouldn't say pensions, can only be used for CalPERS. So you can put money into this PFM or PARS trust, and then as you feel appropriate, transfer it over to CalPERS to take care of your contributions, okay? So there's 2 primary reasons I think agencies are interested in doing this. I think there's really only 2 I know of so far that have done this. One is an agency in Southern California. I've drawn blank now on which one that is. The other is Solano County up here in the Bay Area. But the primary two reasons I think you would consider this one is it gives you more control over what your contribution rates are, right? If you put the 12 million in, you could then contribute at a rate maybe that you think is appropriate, and then sort of set that 12 million aside for like a rainy day fund. If performance is really poor in the CalPERS trust, you'd have that $12 million sitting there. That money could be in theory, it could earn a lot more than it would in your general fund reserves, right? Because it could be invested differently. And that's the other reason I think it's getting some interest is you're not tied to CalPERS investments, right? So in this trust, you have control over how the money's invested. You could do anything from kind of mirroring, I think, what CalPERS has in terms of investments to being very conservative, right? So that's a recent option that's out there. That's something that you might want to consider. So let me cover the last slide here, which is I've seen all the contribution rates increasing over the next 10 years. Probably there's yeah.
Drum roll, please.
So yeah, and it's really that. And this is one of those things, like a lot of numbers just needs a perspective, right? If you look at the bottom corner there on slide 8, this is showing that we're projecting the unfunded liability for both plans to be in total $26 million as of June 30th, 2014. So there's a couple of reasons. Well, one reason this is important is because this is the number that will go on the balance sheet. Not, CalPERS is going to give you this exact number, but we're saying that we project this to be pretty close to 26 million. This is the number that will go on your balance sheet under GASB 68, right? The unfunded liability. If you looked at this historically, if you went even back 2 years to June 30, 12, it was $42 million. Okay, and that's
I'm sorry, 2012?
June 30, 2012.
Okay.
That number was
42
about $42 million unfunded. So it's come down quite a bit, and this number here does not include the 12 million. I mean, if you pay an additional 12 million to the trust, that drops by 12, it's down to 14 million. Setting aside the fact that I'd have to think through from an accounting standpoint, right, how that gets counted. I think it can get counted, but I mean, the fact that you would be measuring this for GASB 68 at June 30, 14, but if the contribution came in at June 30, 15, how does it count? I think it gets counted here, but right, bottom line is your unfunded would be lower. It's just a matter of how you'll be able to count that 12 million that was made after this measurement date. So
technically 14, but yeah, it's timing, right? That's how they do it.
right.
Yeah.
So that's the Cliff Notes. The rest was, in more detail. I was trying to cover like the main points of this up front and sort of leave the gritty details in the back. But certainly, if there's any questions,
Doug, can I make it, so a couple points too, because even before 2012, and Doug mentions 42 million, I mean, we had discussed at one point way back as high as 60 million or more in unfunded liability before we paid off the 3 at 50. So, I heard a number one time, 80, I'm not sure that was realistic, but, again, 60 I think was probably more aligned before 2012 and before we paid off the 3 at 50 side fund.
Right.
So, going from that to a potential of 14 million unfunded, it's a huge change, and I think a big difference in what has been not only perceived, but all the work that's been done. And, when I said earlier what's going to be the direction of staff, I mean, obviously, the board has different options based upon what's laid out. One of the options is to do nothing, too. So, we've looked at that before. We're worried about our cash position. Obviously gave you two options tonight with what could be done here, but there's a third out there as well. So we're going to need, if you choose, some direction on, again, where does this go next? Does it go to the finance committee? But I think the game changer here for me was when I heard the presentation is that's a significant change in unfunded liability from what we've been told, as early as 3, 4, 5 years ago, based upon the moves that we made. So.
Questions for, yes, Chuck?
I'm just not clear, is the 26 million based on the 7.5% discount rate?
yes, it is.
And, I mean, all the analysts, and I think it's even in your report, suggest that actual long-term this rates are in the 3 to 4 to 5% range.
Well, I don't know long-term, I mean,
Say last 10 years.
yeah, you know, last 10 years,
I thought I read it in your own report.
I don't think it was that low. I could actually tell you, I think the last 10 years, they're 7 to 8%, somewhere in there. Part of the reason this has come down from, you know, I always mention the June 30, 12 as a yardstick. Fiscal, for June 30, 13 and 14, the returns were 13% and 18%. So, you know, and we have, maybe I can forward so you can see the historical returns here. Oops, passed it right here. Might be hard to see. And we have like something, you should probably ignore that last entry point in 2015 because that was based on some partial returns for that year. But if you start from 14 there and go backwards, right, you can see there's the 18%, 13.2, then there was 0.1, but then 21.7, right, 13.3. Obviously the 08-09 year was pretty bad, you know, 06-07. But when you average all that out, I think you're somewhere between 7 and 8% for a 10-year period. So there's debate out there, I realize, about whether going forward that 7.5 will be realized. I think maybe that's right, what you're,
Well, what I'm suggesting, and I know it's not linear, but if the rate were only 4 or 5%, the obligation would be upwards of
Much higher.
Much higher, 40
Yeah,
million.
right. And that, you know, one of the things about that number that we're looking at, the $26 million, is that, you know, it's going to be very volatile in the future, right? I mean, you have, if you look at that slide, there's about 150 million in assets, right? So if you get a return that's 10% below or below 7.5%, there's a $15 million swing on that unfunded liability, right? So there's going to be no question it's going to vary a lot in the future.
Let me ask then about the so-called red line in all of this. And I don't know quite how 12 million was selected or whatever, but do we have the option of paying 26 million and eliminating our red line entirely?
You could. Now, one thing to keep in mind in doing, if you're considering something like that, is that the pension reform bill, PEPRA, requires that you always pay the normal cost. So,
Oh, I'm sorry, the what?
so you always pay the normal cost, despite whatever the funded status is, you have to at least pay the normal cost. The reason behind it was to try to get agencies used to paying that, right? One of the things that went wrong years ago was that CalPERS, when it was overfunded, said, oh, well, you can use those assets to increase your benefit formulas, right? And they used those assets to pay the normal cost. The pension reform says, no, going forward, every agency has to pay the normal cost. The point here they want to make, though, is that there is a danger if you become overfunded, that because of the pension reform law, there's you know, attorneys could probably speak better to this than I can, but the pension reform law has some very narrow criteria for when you can not contribute the normal cost. So you're going to essentially always need to contribute that. If you became overfunded, you still have to continue to put that normal cost in, and you could become even more overfunded. So I would just, that's, you know, so it puts agencies in a tough place in a way, because it's a great goal to pay an unfunded liability off, to get that off the books, but then you have this other law that says, well, okay, once you become overfunded, you still have to put money into the plan.
Yeah.
So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place.
So to the 12 million, and actually you raised a very good question, because it's presumed that maybe every board member knew this, but that is the money that the district has set aside in its reserve currently, based upon saving at 41%, and based upon having employee positions that were not filled. That money goes right into that reserve. So we have positions that are unfilled. We've saved for those positions, which you've noted earlier. but that's where the money goes. So the reason we have $12 million is because every time that occurred, that's where the funding was put in that reserve. So that's what's available in that fund to pay down towards this obligation.
Well, in theory, I mean, our whole reserve is available, we could pay 50 million.
You could, but this was dedicated based upon, rules and criteria put in place by the board where they wanted that money specifically focused for that purpose. In the past, we've said, and one of the reasons Stephen came up was, do we keep that reserve there because we know we keep the cash in bank and it's dedicated towards that? Up until recently when this came up, it was, well, what if we paid and applied the money early, what would the effect be? Would it change payroll? The answer is, yes, it would change payroll. Would it reduce the unfunded liability? Yes, it would reduce the unfunded liability. So this is an option. We can do something with it, do nothing with it. At the same time, we'll continue to save in that specific fund.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I would like to ask about an assumption whereby, I thought I read in the report, but now I'm thinking maybe I didn't, but about the cost of going to the third tier that PEPRA permits for
Yeah,
safety employees.
There's, that's, I think we go to E16, let me pull it up here.
And it's tier 2, right?
Tier 2, right.
Yeah.
It's, so you currently have the 350 tier 1, and then you have the PEPRA people at 2.757, and this is the question like, well, what if you set another tier up, right?
Yes.
And so, now the thing is that, if you look at your total column there on slide E16, you have, 14.2% of payroll is going for the unfunded liability. I'm sorry, the first column here, that number, right? That, that I'm sorry, it's not that number. 14.2% of payroll, setting up a second tier doesn't change that at all, right? You still have that contribution, and then what happens is, as new people come in under the formula, here are the new normal cost rates that would apply. So what you're seeing there is that, these rates, this is the basic normal cost. It's a little different than this. Let's just look at that first line. For your tier 1, 17.5% of payroll. For your PEPRA people, as it currently stands, 10.4% of payroll. If you set up another tier to cover under a lower formula, the new firefighters coming in, it only drops it down to 10% of payroll if you went to the 2.5 at 57 formula, and down to 8.5% of payroll for the 2.0 at 2% at 57 formula. So there's certainly some savings there, but I think what this is showing, again, doesn't affect that unfunded liability at all, right? And then it has a marginal impact on the normal cost, and a marginal, certainly 10.4, I think the 10 is marginal, maybe
But not the
10.4 to 8.5 is not marginal. It's, 2% of payroll is probably, significant, but it's not maybe as dramatic a change as one might think with setting up another tier. Were those the numbers you were looking at?
Yes, although, let me ask, in terms of the risk, one of the things that we saw with our current plan is that we could be actually paying up to, at the very high end of the projections, over 62% or something of payroll, so there's a wide fluctuation
Right.
in terms of risk. What happens to the risk for, say, the 2% at 57? To what extent does that narrow the band of risk? And how could one calculate that?
Or like how much would it bring down to 62%?
Right.
It would have some impact, but not a huge impact. I know those are like squirrely words. It doesn't give you a number, but the fact is that, if you looked at our projection here goes to 22, 23, right?
Yeah.
All your firefighters at that point are not gonna be Pepra, right? You're still gonna have a number of them that are under the 350 formula, right? So you're gonna have a lot under the classic. And the fact is that the assets that you're either, the spread on those contributions is because of the asset returns, right? The big gains and losses are gonna be on the base that's there today, that 150 million roughly. It's not gonna be on the amounts that you're putting in over the next 4 years or 5 years. So for those two reasons, I don't know if that makes sense, but for those two reasons, if you went to another tier, it's gonna narrow these bands a little bit in terms of the risk. And long term, it'll make a bigger difference, but in the next 5 years, it's not gonna make a dramatic, it's not gonna increase that variation by, 20% or 30%, I don't think.
How would one go, but let's say
Yeah.
15 or 20 years out, it,
Yeah, it's hard to say off the top of my head, but, 20 years, I just don't know, I'd have to, I can't do that in my head, so I could look at that if I give you a number, but if I looked at it closer, but I can't come up with something right now.
Okay.
So direction is
Any
staff.
other, yeah, I was gonna just, any other comments, Rex or Peter or Rob? Okay.
I'm relying on Chuck here.
So,
let me just, I'm sorry, just one more question. It seems to me, I understand the age 50 to 57, there's 7 more years there, but I'm looking at, you say these differences don't make much difference, but between tier 1, 3% at 50, and Pepper at 2.7,
there's a
the
7.5.
total
Well,
I see you're putting, it's because there's no past history that you're trying to catch up with, that's the major
yeah, that's
figure.
it, and also that if you put this new tier in, no one is gonna go from this tier 1 to this one.
Right.
What you're doing is you're changing people in the future that would have been here to here. And that's why I'm saying it's a small change, because everyone here is locked in on the 3 at 50. You're not changing that with another tier, right? They're all gonna be here. What you do with another tier is you're moving
Yeah.
people
And
higher in
that's
the
the
future from
significant-
here to this, and this, I'm saying, is quite small. This, from 10.4 to 8.5, yeah, that's 2% payroll roughly, right? That's something there certainly, but what I'm referring to is quite small, is that 10.4 to 10%.
So,
One last thing, how do the employee percentages relate to this in terms of change, what they pay?
their contribution.
Yes.
Yeah, well, so they're roughly, under the Pepper formulas, the employees pay roughly half of the normal cost, and most of those rates, they're normal cost rates. So the employees are paying, close to 11.5 to 12% of pay on those formulas.
Show me where, I'm not doubting you, but where is the 11.5 to 12%?
I'm saying, well, this is 11.5, and this is 11.9 or 12. So I'm saying, under Pepper, there's 50/50, there's cost sharing, even cost sharing between employer and employees. So these rates here both represent half of the total cost. And so if the district is paying 11.5% of pay, there's another 11.5 that's being paid by the employee. And same with this one, the district's paying 11.9, there's another 11.9 being paid by the employee.
And what's our, of the 34.5%, what's, the firefighters are only would be paying half of the normal cost, right?
Well, under this, because this formula is not under the cost sharing provision of PEPRA, there's a 9% employee rate. And I forget now if the district's picking that up or if the
Don't employees pay that?
Employees, okay,
Yeah,
so
they
employees
pay
pay
that.
9% then,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And there's no other cost sharing as far as I know, right? The employees are paying the 9.
Yeah, unless it was negotiated with through a labor agreement.
yeah.
So does that mean that the total there under tier one is not 34.5, but less than 9%?
Yeah.
No, this is just employer.
That's, yeah.
Right,
So
so
total-
what's the 9% that they pay would be,
The 9% is on top of this 34.
Right,
Yes.
CalPERS is
Yes.
getting 34.5 plus 9%
The
from the
9%,
employees, so
right.
they're getting 43.5%
yeah.
total.
Thank you.
Any other comments? So the choices are, it sounds like do nothing,
That's
keep
an
12
option.
million in the reserve,
Right.
use the 12 million to pay down the 26 million, right?
Correct.
Or-
But also reduce the amount that the rate for payroll,
Yes,
because it reduces
yeah.
by about 7%.
Yeah, and then, or, kick it back to, well, we can have another board discussion next month, or kick it back to finance, if you wanna look at it, I don't know where y'all want
Well,
it.
so which methodology in there would be selected? That's the, we don't know that. If the answer is yes, we want to use it, then he's listed at least 2 methods in there that could be used. And there
Okay.
is a third.
So, yes,
I'm sorry, I want to ask one more question. Is the opportunity to pay down a one-time only opportunity, or can we pay down every year?
As far as I know, you get paid down extra every year.
But I would point out, as you did earlier,
the norm.
when we paid down the 12 million before, we got a pretty good deal. It's not at all clear that they're not gonna change the rules moving forward.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, we paid off the side fund,
Yeah.
so that the rules were different for the side fund. This gets
And
you
that
to a
door is
benefit.
closed, you know, people who didn't do that.
Right. Well, I mean, if you paid 12 this time, we got it down to 14, then we'd have to have a different discussion next time based upon what we put in the reserve. You keep it, invest it, cash position, I mean, that's the, you can still have a reserve to cover it. We actually had a discussion the other day, because once you give it to them, the rules change. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask Kathy, you were going to, I know you're working on an analysis of our investment policy and so forth. Compared to the 0.25% we're earning now or something, we're earning effectively 0 on our investments now. I think one of the issues would be, what would be an expectation of a return we could make if instead of investing in CalPERS, we invested it
The PARS,
in some other, some other vehicle.
You mean us invested or PARS?
Well,
Because if
we don't
it's
have
us,
to give it to PARS, right now we're giving it to, what's their name?
Leif,
The LAIF, yeah.
local agency
Right,
investment
and
fund.
they're not doing anything with it, so,
Well, they're a day in, day out. I mean, it's a money market fund, so.
right. But it just seems to me, we should look at what we could return. And Peter was talking about his nonprofit, I know we probably are limited
Yeah,
in
no,
doing that, but
yeah, we definitely have very
they're,
different rules, so we don't wanna.
they're earning 10%, so.
Yeah, no, there's no way you can get 10%. The normal portfolio, if you look at any agency, is between 75 and 100 basis points. So it's just a bad,
That's all,
yeah.
that's less than 1%.
You know, part of that is, you're starting to see portfolios stay a little bit shorter, like under a 2-year average life, so that because the expectations that rates will go up, so you don't want to be stuck way out necessarily. But then again, that's been expectations for a
right,
while, so.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, I would just comment that, we are, our mission being a fire agency, not being a bank or investment activity, and I've seen a lot of institutions forget that, they're not in the investment business.
Right,
Whatever we say about CalPERS, they do spend a lot of time and effort making good investments.
Yeah, and they're
They're
allowed
not
to do a
all-
lot of different things. I mean, they're
Yeah.
doing
They're
real
big enough
estate
to
and they're
it.
doing,
Yeah, and
all
they've
the
not
things.
necessarily had good results, but it's not clear, given the constraints on us, that we could do anywhere near as well.
No,
I mean, we may hate CalPERS, but that doesn't change the fact that they're doing better than we can do, I think. I mean,
Yeah, you look at their history, they've obviously had tough years, but overall, yeah, it's hard to find, pension plans that are performing as well as CalPERS has.
They have a mix of every kind of investment
Very diversified
type,
portfolio.
yeah.
Yeah.
They have a big staff that
And
manages it.
And to your point, Director Carpenter, our primary thing, you said, it's about security. And I know Kathy listed that last time. What was it? Security, liquidity?
Preservation.
Liquidity,
Yeah.
yield.
Yeah. Wow.
There was a time when the Teamsters Union had their pension assets seized by the federal government, and the trucking companies that were involved had to come up with the funding for their annuitants in the pension system, because the federal government had seized funds because of corruption aspect. Now, I know CalPERS has been under a little bit of a cloud relative to some federal investigations in the Los Angeles area. Some former board members were charged. What would our liability be if the same thing happened to us and being a member of CalPERS? Would we be held responsible for those payments if like a federal entity came in and seized those assets? I already posed this to our legal counsel, I never got an answer. Since you do this.
If attorneys didn't want to answer that, I don't think that.
Smart.
There you go.
But,
No, I just want to know what our, because
I
I
mean,
bet you some of those trucking companies are a little surprised that they had to come up with the funds for those retirees, huh?
I mean, certainly the responsibility for funding the plans is not CalPERS, right? I mean, it's the district's responsibility for funding the plan, right?
Right.
And I think that's the point you're making, right?
Yes, that's the
Now,
point of, exactly, that's the point of it.
Yeah, I can't speculate on, a crazy scenario where, I can't imagine it happening in a, we're going to speculate on it, but certainly responsibility for funding is with the district. CalPERS is not going to step in and contribute anything to these plans, right? So,
I just think it's something that we just need to be aware of,
yep.
that we're ultimately held responsible for this.
Yeah, it kind of gets back a little bit to that PARS trust, is that I don't know that I see it as a, getting into the investment business at all. I see it as potentially, if you thought you didn't want that risk. I mean, CalPERS at times has talked about having different levels of different portfolios, but they just haven't been able to implement that, right? If you think about this, when they take money from a new agency today that has all active employees, nobody's receiving a payment from the agency, they invest that money where they're not going to pay anyone out for 30 years, the same as they're investing your money where you have many more retirees than you have actives, right? And does that really make sense? It doesn't really make sense, but they've done pretty well. But it is an argument that, do you really want that level of risk? You don't really have an option with CalPERS. If you wanted to take the 12 million you had and invest it where you get a little more return, but you don't take on the volatility and the risk that CalPERS has, that's an argument for this new trust.
Yeah, and I think that as we get closer, making this $12 million payment this time makes sense. And then the next year, if it is at 14 million, then we start going, well, how much do we want to do at that point? I mean, we don't want to necessarily bring it down to zero, like he was saying.
Yeah, I don't think the 12 million by itself, I mean, it just happens to be that we have a little pot that says 12 on it, but could just as easily say 20, it could just as easily say 5. It seems to me.
I don't agree with that. I mean, this is a reserve we created for a particular
For
purpose.
this.
Yeah, I know, but it's just because you did. but we have this other reserve
Yeah,
that is
we have
it's
a reserve
undesignated.
No, we have reserves for capital equipment replacement, et cetera, and that was part of the discipline that we went through.
Yeah.
So I reject the notion that we can sort of arbitrarily say, as Chuck Bernstein would say, take it from one pocket and put it in the other.
It's just because, I mean, that just happens to be how much change you have in that pocket.
No, it is not.
No, it was definitely a disciplined approach to put that
Oh,
money in.
that's silly. One day,
No, I-
one year, we happen to have this big thing, and we get money back from the state, and so you say, okay, put it in
That's-
reserve. That isn't a
that's
disciplined approach, it just means we got a windfall, we stuck it in there.
Chuck, you were not involved in the conversations. We looked at what we thought was gonna be our future liability. And we said, given that, this is the rate at which we are gonna charge ourselves. That was a conscious decision, recorded in the minutes. You know, this reserve is not a casual thing that we made up over the poker table.
But a lot more money went in there than what you're talking about, it went in from all sorts of sources. It did.
I don't care what the sources was, the purpose of setting up the fund and the amount of funding was based on the, we said, we think it's gonna be 41%. By God, we were pretty close.
Here's my point in saying that, is that I think we could afford, and I'm mindful of the problem of putting too much money in, but I think we could afford to put more money in and actually lower our future payments. Given that we're only earning 0.25% on these investments, we're not getting any return. I think we could put in more than 12 million, we could put in 20 million of.
That's a
whatever.
different question.
But that's what I'm saying, the fact that,
Well, that's, what
that was the point I was trying to
Well,
make.
do
you didn't,
Okay,
you
I
made
didn't
it,
make it clear.
if you want to put more money in there, that's fine, but what's in there is in there for a particular purpose.
I agree, but I think we might want to even consider putting more in this.
Well, so do you want to kick it back to the finance committee to see what that would look like by putting more in and,
Can I ask where the more comes from? The other reserve, or for
I mean, yeah, because the
specific
12
purpose?
million was
The other
pretty
pocket.
specific. So where were you
Yeah.
thinking the more? I mean, but that could be something the finance committee could look at. I'm actually, so, I'm actually-
Yes, I think it would come from
From equipment
Undesignated.
replacement reserve, or for,
the undesignated reserves that we have. We have more reserves,
CIP?
well, that, this probably isn't the place to have that conversation, but we have the difference between our assets and our liabilities. I'm not sure the exact number, maybe $60 million or whatever. If you look at those, what that's designated for in terms of interest and all those kinds of things, it doesn't use up all that money. There is more money available to us. And we can call it whatever. We've got the rainy day fund, the fear fund. We've got all these kinds of funds, but we've got more money in there. We've got a lot of money in our reserve.
well, sir, are you saying that you're saying that you don't want to use the 12 million? I'm actually.
Yeah, I'm saying I think we should consider putting more in.
Call the question.
Well, there's no motion, so
Well, so I'm
you want to
trying
make a motion?
Yeah, that we forward it to the finance committee for further research and review and see if we want to invest more than the 12, or we want to go forward with the 12, or we, as the chief had mentioned, our third option, which would be to do nothing.
So basically, you want to kick it back to the finance committee for a recommendation.
Yes. Have a second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion? Last minute discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so that's unanimous. Okay, so Chuck, item 18 is yours. What do you want to do with that? Which is,
Well, I'd like to just make a quick presentation. I know that
Well-
I was late, but
well, hold on, before you can even make that, I think that we as a board have to consider, we have to vote on whether or not we even want to. I'm talking about 18.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I want to at least explain what I'm proposing here to be able to have an intelligent.
Okay, just so you know, the item is under consideration, so you have to vote to even move forward, but you can make your case.
Again, okay.
It's getting late, so I don't want
I basically, I think we have a problem with CalPERS. I think in terms of their management of costs, I think Peter is sending us things 2 or 3 times a week about how poorly managed they are, and really almost on the border of being a criminal enterprise. And I think we need to have the least involvement with them that we possibly can. And I'm suggesting that we put into our next contract a plan to go to a lower tier, the 2% at 57, to do that. And I think it's the kind of thing that we can't wait for very long, because we're in the midst of discussions with the union now. And if we had a 3-year contract or whatever, we couldn't consider it until after that. This is something that wouldn't affect any current employees at all. It would only affect future employees. I think wasn't very well highlighted there, but the bands of risk. The fact is, we're already exceeding, the expected level is exceeding the 41% that was a very conservative figure that the board put into place a couple of years ago. We're already talking about 42, 43%, and it could be as high as 62%. I just think it's an out of control kind of thing, and that we should be dealing with that. So at the top, what I propose, not proposing tonight, I guess, I don't know if we change everything, but I would like to propose that we have a motion to put that into our contract negotiations with the IAAF, and make that a part of our contract position. So that's what I'm like the board to consider.
Is there a second?
Sorry, what's the motion? Just to,
Well, it's
Well, I move
basically-
that we consider a lower tier plan from CalPERS as part of our contract considerations.
that's fine. That will be the conversation.
Right. Do you have a comment here?
Yeah, my concern, and the reason I haven't seconded the motion, is that we have months ago begun discussions with the union, and I worry that at this point, changing the rules of the game is not in our best interest, number one. Number two, I don't know, and maybe Kathy or Harold can enlighten me, how much flexibility we have as a participant in the CalPERS program in terms of introducing additional tiers and additional things. You know, the new tier was a consequence of a change in state law. And so it's not clear to me we have any options. I would be comfortable seconding a motion which asks the staff to come back to us and tell us what our options are. Because I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know whether what you proposed is something we could legally do. So if you would like to make a motion to ask the staff for options, I would certainly support that. But I'm uncomfortable supporting the motion that you've just made, and I want you to know why.
You can amend your motion if you want. Oh, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to say something also. I would like to go into, as something what Peter suggested, going into areas where we are members of CalPERS, but to work on maybe employee contributions, maybe maximum age where that, like the highway patrol has, where a highway patrolman can't be any older than 60 years old and they have to retire. Things that we can implement and still work within the CalPERS framework. I think bringing up a third tier at this time is kind of a bad situation because we're currently in negotiations with the union now, and I think they kind of sets a bad foundation for that. I would love to, with new employees, offer them a 401k type plan, but because we're members of CalPERS, we're restricted to do that under CalPERS, under California code. I mean, there's a lot of ways I can think of being involved in the federal system where we could use some of those federal rules, but there are a lot of CalPERS restrictions, which what Peter brought up relative to have staff come back with the rules that we have to abide by under CalPERS. So,
Well, I would be, oh, I'm sorry, I was just gonna
That's
say,
all I
I'd
have.
certainly be willing to restate the motion to be a request that the staff brings back a proposal for different pension options, including some of the things that you stated, Rob.
So you could withdraw your original.
And I would second that.
Okay, so
Or
withdraw your
work with the
first.
staff on options. Because there are legal constraints and things like that, and then we could look at it. And I would just add to the comment that Director Bernstein made. My concern was with CalPERS is to a large degree, not so much with their investment performance, but because I think they've been politically motivated to have artificially low contribution rates. And we, local governments, all were willing participants in that charade, because we thought, gee, isn't this wonderful, we don't have to pay very much. And the problem is not that their investment performance has been horrible, the problem is that our contributions have not been appropriate. And GASB is now making that very clear. So, as we talked earlier, I think if you look over the last 10, 20 years, CalPERS done a very good job on the return on investments. They've done a very poor job of making appropriate demands of the participating agencies to pay as you go. And we got sucked into it.
So Chuck, procedurally, you want to withdraw your original one and make?
No, I think we've amended
I
it.
just
and I seconded
Oh,
it.
sorry,
I
okay, I didn't
restated
hear
it.
that.
He
Okay,
restated
did
it
you
and
get
I
that,
seconded
Michelle?
it.
Okay, great. So there's a second to that motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed?
Yes.
Okay. 3-2, the motion carries.
I'm sorry, Rob, you voted against, right?
yes, I did.
Okay.
I'd like to say something for the
Sure,
record.
please.
We had a special session involving CalPERS with Chuck Reed, and he made his presentation and pretty much outlined the restrictions that we had under CalPERS being members. And I'm really fortunate to hear his side of the story, because you really don't really hear all the facts sometimes because of different forms of information, media, things get exaggerated. And the thing that really concerned me was that Chuck Reed has a police department that is low in staffing. Specialized units are not being filled. And then he gets driven to our conference by a police officer that's assigned to him as a driver. Now, that kind of struck me a little bit funny. And then secondly, when he had talked about CalPERS, he's a member of CalPERS, but yet he has instituted on the city or those new police officers another retirement system, even though he is a member of CalPERS. So I sat there and listened to him, and he had outlined some of those restrictions. So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. Okay. Rex, do you have?
No?
Okay, item 19, Peter?
Yeah, I can make this real quick. I would, one of the
things that's nice about this board is that we all have a number of interactions and connections. We also have designated liaisons, and I would just ask each of us, if we interact with an elected official or an appointed official in a jurisdiction for which there's a liaison, let that liaison know that you're having that interaction. You don't need to ask permission, but just let that person know so that they're aware of it.
Can you be specific though? Are you talking about if you write them a letter or send them an email?
Well, I think it's a judgment call. I mean, if I write a letter signing it as a director of the district, then I think I should share that with my fellow directors. But another example is Ray Mueller, who's a current council member who was mayor, asked me, he said, I want to get together for breakfast. I said, sure. I said in my response, I said, I'm not the liaison for the city of Menlo Park, and I don't speak for the fire district. But I copied that response to Harold and Virginia, so they at least knew what I was up to. So it's a judgment call. And I'm just saying, if we have for example, if I were to have an interaction with one of the East Palo Alto people, council members or the city manager, I would think it would be appropriate to just tell you I was going to do that, and that you'd be aware of it. That's all.
Okay.
Okay?
I'm sorry, just going to ask, because just so I want to be clear. As an example, on my street, we have a school thereby it's going to be an issue with my street.
Yeah.
If I write a letter to the city council about dealing with the O'Connor school, are you suggesting that I should let Rex know?
No.
Are you going to sign it director fire district?
I would never sign anything as a director.
Fine, that's different. But Ray asked me to get together, not because I'm some Atherton resident he sort of wants to have breakfast with, because I'm a director of the fire district. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to talk to you, but I'm not the liaison, and I don't speak for the fire district.
Well, I'm not provoking, I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you'd like to have us do, because,
No, like I called Peter when I met with the mayor of Atherton,
Yeah.
because Peter was a liaison. I said, Peter, I'm going to have coffee with with the mayor of Atherton. And since you're the liaison, I just want to let you know.
If it's not clear, then just leave it unclear. I don't want
Just a phone call.
to belabor it anymore and like to move on to the next subject.
I'm going to ask one, just like, I've never seen this, but maybe, do you routinely sign letters that you're from the fire board?
Never have.
Okay.
But I use that as an example.
Okay. Because I would never sign anything that was from the fire board unless it was official, so I just want to be clear.
Well, there's ambiguity. For example, if you say something to a reporter, it's not uncommon for the reporter to say, Peter Carpenter, Fire Board Director. Even though you preface the remark to the reporter saying, I was not speaking for the fire board or for the district. So sometimes, you don't get to decide how people describe you.
Any other questions?
Okay?
Duly noted, Peter, thank you. So our final item is 23, which is basically our strategic, consider and discuss and provide direction to the staff on the chief's priorities and goals for the calendar year for 2015, which would be
Madam
our
President,
goal.
I'd like to make a suggestion on this.
Yes.
I'd like to move this to the strategic planning committee and meet with the chief and go over what he's presented and parallel our strategic plan with that, and then come back to the board with a staff recommendation.
Well, I think that in order for him to move forward with the staff, based on our board priorities that we set at the last meeting, we can just get this out of the way with the board's input, and we can move forward and have a meeting of the strategic planning committee in mid-year, which is exactly where we had discussed twice a year. That would be the first meeting. But I'm, I'm open to other suggestions, but my feeling is let's just get this done so that the staff knows and the chief knows where exactly they should be headed for the rest of the year. Chuck?
Well, I think the chief has raised a number of questions in here. I mean, these aren't marching orders where he's saying, I'm ready to proceed on this. He's sort of saying, I don't know what you mean on this, some of these things.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that perhaps we ought to have a meeting with the chief about his goals, a confidential, closed personnel meeting on terms of the chief's performance, and that we ought to discuss these things with the chief in that regard.
Well, I certainly think we can discuss performance in closed session. I don't think that we can establish goals without some, I think that's stretching the boundaries of a closed session.
Yeah, I agree, especially if it's the board's goals, what the chiefs should be, what we want and expecting the chief, that has to be done at a.
There is an exception for performance evaluation for closed session, but the goal setting is clearly does not fall within that exception. Lauren, correct me if I'm
But the problem here is that some of these things I don't think relate to the chief's goals. For example, it says, reduce unfunded liabilities. I mean, it's not up to the chief to just go around reducing unfunded liabilities. So I'm not even sure how to deal with some of these things.
So maybe, yeah.
That's why I made the motion that we go back to strategic planning and have us break down not only the strategic plan, but the chief's goals and his staff goals, and get some more specific specifics relative to some of these. So that's my motion. Liz?
Is there a second? Okay, the motion failed.
I would second that.
Okay. Any
My
discussion?
only comment on that, Rob, and let me say is, I don't think there's any reason that you couldn't meet with the chief about strategic planning. I'm just not sure these goals are strategic, and so I'm a little.
Well, that's why we would, Virginia and I would go down with our committee, and if the chief needed to bring certain staff members that he assigned certain projects to, maybe we can get to specifics relative to our generalized plan and our specific plan, and then report to the,
Well, I would be willing to do that if it's a very focused discussion on what the outcomes were from last month and what is within
Can I?
a piece of paper. Yes, please.
So, last month, obviously about this time, I think we were putting stuff up on the board. Not everybody could stay. You at that time didn't get the culmination of what this was, so Michelle put that together. And I have to say, it's kind of a hybrid of all those things. It was difficult to understand, as Director Bernstein mentioned, unfunded liabilities. I'm not sure what that meant. I think I get it. But, I did comment, staff did help me write some of the responses, because as we sat around and said, okay, what's the board goal? It wasn't necessarily always clear what it was, because, it's not only that I get it, staff gets it, and, we delegate those responsibilities to different people. So, I tried to be as honest as I could within the paragraphs here of, if it doesn't seem clear, it's because it isn't. If it is clear, like number one, just trying to remind you that 4 different, groups of people that, either require negotiation or some level of compensation, not just the 2 unions. Those are ones where, yeah, we should go through these and spend some time to do that for everybody's benefit. So how you do that is clearly your choice, but it needs to be done.
Could I ask just for the council, our council, about the chief's performance? If some of the goals, it's not, but I'm just trying to make up an example. If some of this dealt with things like trying to improve the effectiveness of the organization, which meant dealing with personnel in certain ways and so forth, is that a conversation that we could have as part of the chief's performance? Or is that is in closed session, or would that require an open meeting?
It would probably require an open meeting. But I could see that we could have some of those topics in closed session, and during the closed session, we could direct the conversation to make sure we stay within the confines of closed session.
I
think it's important to distinguish between setting the goal and evaluating performance against it.
That's, yeah, I would.
Setting the
agree.
goal, I think, has to be done in public. Evaluating performance against it can be done in closed session, but does not have to be done in
I would
closed
agree with that statement.
And what about when the goal arises out of organizational needs or something of that sort? In other words, where you're commenting upon performance and you want to improve the performance as a goal.
Then you have to, that has to be an open session discussion to change the goals.
I think I'd have to see that exact context. I can see a situation in closed session where talking about goals related directly to a performance evaluation, but going into a closed session with the intention of talking about the goals, that needs to be an open session. So I think I need a little bit more context, if that makes sense.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Rex, would you like to add? Virginia, our president.
Oh, okay.
Left for a few minutes, that's why. Anyone else have any more discussion?
No, I was voting for it.
Okay,
Okay,
all in
Should
favor?
we wait till she returns?
Well, yeah, we
I was
have,
gonna ask, how we would do the vote with.
We have a quorum.
We do have a quorum.
Meeting began with a quorum. We still have a quorum.
We can proceed, but of course, if the vote hinged on her vote, we would want her to come back. I mean,
Okay.
it's up to you. You
I
can
call
vote
the
or you
question.
can wait.
okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Against?
Aye. Nay, sorry.
So, if motion carries 3-1 with one absent.
And in the interest of time,
Just please make sure that you write that she was out of the room, she didn't abstain.
and in the
Can we
interest.
vote again?
You should, you can vote again.
Can we
if
vote
you'd like.
again?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just-
Michelle, could you read the motion for us, please? I'm sorry.
Sorry.
um,
The motion was to have the chief's priorities and goals sent to the strategic planning committee and have the committee discuss with the chief
Can I take over?
its goals in regards to the strategic plan.
Okay, and we have a motion and a second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Okay.
And you want to close?
Yes,
So the motion carries. Okay,
Madam President,
yes.
in the interest of time, I would move that we note receipt of items 24 through 30,
Okay,
as none of them require action on our part.
yeah. There's a second.
That's it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the mo- who moved it.
Peter?
Pardon?
Peter motion.
And the second was, okay, thank you.
Rob. And then Chuck, you had a comment, quick comment?
Well, I was just curious how these things even got on the agenda, or what was the source of it?
They're just informational items.
From the director, from the chief?
From the chief, all the approved minutes from committee meetings.
No, I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about articles from
Yeah,
newspapers.
from the fire chief. And the directors, sometimes the directors will send me items as informational items.
I see. Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to bring up, that we need a strategic plan committee meeting in March.
Okay.
Since we voted
You
on
want to tell Michelle? Well, we can talk to Michelle.
And I would also note for the record that I will be absent at the March meeting, and I'll be in Europe, and I do not wish to participate by phone, because I don't really think it's possible to do a good job by phone, and I have every confidence that my colleagues will do a good job.
Michelle's.
And when I get the packet, which I'll get from Michelle, if I have comments or anything, I will send comments to you.
Great. And I think we still need to take a vote on the last motion.
Oh, all in
My
favor
husband
for
is-
the, all in favor of the last motion to,
Note and file the receipt of.
what?
It was note and file the receipt of items 24.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Which is
She's
fine.
in
Get the
favor,
vote.
aye.
Aye.
So it's unanimous.
Thank
Michelle
you.
didn't get the vote, okay. Okay, so that's it for our regular agenda. So public comment number 3. Is there a public comment? No public comment, so that'll be closed.
I may have.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
I will be,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Moved and seconded by Rex. All in favor,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Safe trip, Peter.